Hello and welcome back. Now joining me in the studio, it's been a while, but John Hancock of the International University of Geneva is here with me now. John, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
We're talking IMF today. It's been under a lot of scrutiny in the past few years for its handling of the financial crisis. Then came the Dominic Strauss-Kahn affair. There's been some infrastructure issues. Would you agree that the IMF at the moment is quite unpopular, perhaps at least unfavoured?
Yeah, I think you're right, Thomas. I mean, basically the IMF is never going to be the most popular organization on the block. I mean, typically governments come to the IMF when things are really bad, and the IMF's prescriptions for the country to get better can be difficult, if not brutal, and it's very easy for governments to blame the IMF for the brutality and the stresses they're going through. When the IMF steps in and says, you know, maybe the good times are too good, the party's been going on a little too long, maybe we should take away the punch bowl, that's never too popular in domestic politics either. So basically the IMF sometimes sets itself up and is by definition set up to be bad news. Having said that, I think you're right. After this financial crisis, I think the IMF has come in for a lot of criticism, and I'm not so sure that criticism is always well-founded.
Okay, and that's, I mean, looking at specifics, I mean, IMF policy, for instance, the IMF's conference has been taking place in Geneva. The BRICS countries have been vocal, pointing to the IMF for their way in which their policies were directed to the BRICS countries, perhaps that the IMF didn't take into account these countries, countries like Brazil, Russia. Do you think that that sort of vocalization over the conference period is justified?
I think I think what is forgotten is, first of all, we had one of the biggest financial crises since the 1930s. The world's just gone through it. Lehman Brothers, the Great Recession, the contagion effect in trade and finance, and the worst didn't happen. I mean, cast our mind back to 4 years ago, or certainly after the collapse of Lehman, the whole financial system was going to unravel. Even 2 years ago, 2.5 years ago, Greece was going to precipitate the destruction of the EU. And those bad news, worst case scenarios didn't materialize. And that's partly, even I would say almost largely, because of institutions like the IMF. We forget that over that 4-year period, the IMF provided loans to about 155 countries. That's the bulk of its membership, about 182 billion in loan. It was instrumental in rescuing Greece. It played a role in helping the EU work out, or the Eurozone work out, its other financial issues. It's provided technical assistance to over 90% of its members. It browbeat the G20 into stimulating and upwards of $1 trillion in stimulus.
So you'd say it's doing plenty?
So it's doing loads, and then a lot of this is behind the scenes, and I think people tend to forget this. You know, without institutions like the IMF, or for that matter the World Trade Organization, the World Bank, I'm not so sure we wouldn't have been looking at another 1930s kind of meltdown of the global economy. And I think the second thing to remember is that, you know, the IMF at the end of the day is neither more nor less than its member governments. I mean, you know, we talk about these institutions as if they're kind of a nascent form of world government, but they're not. They're member-driven organizations, members that sometimes have interests that overlap and are mutually enforcing, but often their interests are divergent. And what the BRICS, I think, are complaining about is not so much the IMF, but probably certain key developed country economies, in this case probably the United States, and their concerns about the effects of quantitative easing, or the announcement that quantitative easing is going to come to an end, that the punch bowl is being taken away and its knock-on effects. It's easy to blame the IMF. The IMF is a convenient scapegoat, but underneath the IMF it's always member governments.
Member governments. IMF Managing Director Christine Lagarde said, and this was in the conference, and I quote, "Monetary policy and central banking will not go back to what they used to be once the crisis is finally behind us." How can she be so sure? And I mean, what sort of alternatives might she be thinking would be available if this happened again?
Well, it's a very important observation you make. I mean, Christine Lagarde in Washington, in a sense, makes this as one of her sort of keynote messages at the IMF. It's not going to be the same. This time it's going to be different. I think the intentions are good, and in some ways things have changed already. I think the level of transparency, for example, about IMF actions, about their policy debate, about their prescriptions, is far more clear today. We know far more about what the IMF is doing. I think there has been some sense out of this crisis that coordinated macroeconomic policies, coordinated monetary policies are desirable, and the very fact we forget that out of the crisis came institutions like the G20, and people complain that it doesn't move fast enough, that it's cumbersome, that there's too many people around the table. But those are also virtues. I mean, there's too many people around the table means there's 20 member governments representing 80% of the world economy around the same table talking. How far we will go toward the goal that Christine Lagarde painted, a new kind of approach to monetary policy, that I think I'm a little bit more skeptical about. I mean, at the end of the day, these governments, the member governments we're speaking about, are answerable to their own constituencies. You know, it's not European voters or Brazilian voters or Indian voters who are going to elect, a Hillary Clinton next time round, or a Jeb Bush, whoever gets elected. It's voters in Texas and Oregon and New York who are going to do it. Policymakers in Washington are answerable to their constituents.
Finally, John, do you think, probably a bit of a silly question this after having listened to what you've been saying throughout this interview, but do you think that the IMF should be given more credit for what it's doing now?
Yeah, I think it definitely should be given more credit, and I think that if we were reflective and stood back a bit and see what we live in a generation where our expectations grossly exceed reality. We are in a world where our economic independence is being translated into a kind of political interdependence, whether we recognize it or not. The world system we've created and that we live with today is far superior to anything that existed even 30 years ago. I mean, think of what Nixon achieved when he blew apart the Bretton Woods system in the 1970s. He didn't consult with the Indians or consult with his European colleagues. He just announced it, and the rest of the world fell into place.
Perhaps that's partly because they're being held more to account than ever before, thanks to things like the internet. But it does interest me that these voices of criticism still need to exist. This holding to account still needs to exist, and there needs to be this sort of ritual, if you like, where the IMF is questioned, because, as you said, it's member states, it's a powerful organisation, so that there is surely still room for those criticisms and for those sort of voices to be heard. Very
good point, Thomas. I mean, in a way, this kind of global democracy you're describing, internet-driven global democracy, and the power of popular demand is what keeps these institutions on their toes. Actually, the IMF has had a good crisis. The world's actually had a good crisis.
A good crisis. An oxymoron in itself.
But if we thought about it objectively, it's true.
Okay, John. Well, thank you very much for coming into the studio again today. We'll have to keep an eye. I have to watch this one, as I'm sure it will play out for a few more years yet, I reckon. John, thanks very much for coming to the studio today. That's all for the moment here on Dukascopy TV. Stay with us. We'll continue to bring you more updates and interviews as the day wears on. But for now, from me, bye-bye.